The war was over, but for the prisoners behind barbed wire, the battle to reclaim their humanity had just begun. In the spring of 1945, thousands of German women soldiers found themselves facing an uncertain future in British captivity. They had served the Third Reich in uniform, sworn loyalty to a regime now condemned by the world, and prepared themselves for punishment, perhaps even revenge. What they could not prepare for was something far more disorienting than cruelty. When British families opened their homes to these former enemies, when children offered kindness where hatred was expected, something inside these women began to fracture, not from brutality, but from compassion. The tears that fell were not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of being treated as human when they had been told they deserved nothing. This is the story of what happened when mercy became the most devastating weapon of all. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe so you never miss our next story. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. Church bells rang across Britain. Strangers embraced in the streets. 6 years of war had finally ended. But while Europe celebrated, another chapter was just beginning for the nearly 500,000 German prisoners of war now held on British soil. Among them were approximately 15,000 women, members of military and paramilitary organizations that had served Hitler's war machine. These were not concentration camp guards, though some British citizens would never make that distinction. They were telegraph operators, searchlight crews, radar technicians, anti-aircraft auxiliaries. Young women who had believed in duty, in country, in a future that now lay in ruins. The women arrived in groups throughout the late spring and summer of 1945, transported from collection points across newly occupied Germany to camps scattered throughout England and Scotland. They wore the remnants of their Wehrmacht auxiliaries uniforms, patched and faded from years of service. Some had been captured during the final chaotic weeks of fighting. Others had surrendered willingly as the regime collapsed around them. They ranged in age from 18 to 45, though most were in their early 20s. Many had joined the women's auxiliary services, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen or communications helpers, between 1940 and 1943, when German propaganda still promised swift victory in a glorious new European order. Now they faced an uncertain captivity in a country they had been taught to despise, among people they had helped bomb from the sky. The British government faced a logistical and moral puzzle. International law required humane treatment of prisoners of war, but these women existed in a gray area. The Geneva Convention primarily addressed male combatants. Women in auxiliary military roles occupied an uncertain legal status. Should they be treated as soldiers, as civilians, as something in between? The War Office issued cautious guidelines. The women would be housed in separate camps from the men. They would receive rations equivalent to British civilians, though food shortages meant those rations were meager. They would be put to work as international law permitted for prisoners of war, but in roles considered appropriate for women: agricultural labor, hospital orderlies, laundry work, food processing. What the official directives could not account for was the human element, the unpredictable chemistry that occurs when former enemies meet face to face, without the distance of propaganda or the fog of war. The women arrived expecting harshness. They had been warned during their military service about British cruelty, about ruthless enemies who would show no mercy to captured Germans. Some carried those fears with them like armor, preparing for abuse, for starvation, perhaps for worse. What they found instead would challenge everything they thought they knew about the enemy, and ultimately about themselves. The camps themselves varied widely. Some were hastily converted military facilities with barbed wire and guard towers, austere reminders of captivity. Others were requisitioned country estates or unused agricultural complexes, places where the architecture of pre-war Britain created strange juxtapositions with their wartime purpose. At a camp near Stratford-upon-Avon, German women prisoners slept in barracks that had once housed Land Army girls. At another facility in the Scottish Highlands, they occupied Nissen huts overlooking the same hills where British commandos had trained for raids on occupied Europe. The physical conditions were Spartan but generally adequate. The real uncertainty lay not in the accommodations, but in what would happen when these women began their daily interactions with the British population. Agricultural work brought the first sustained contact between the German women and British civilians. Britain's farms faced a severe labor shortage. 6 years of war had depleted the agricultural workforce. Men had gone to fight, many had not returned, and those who had were needed for industrial reconstruction. The Women's Land Army had helped fill the gap, but even they were stretched thin. German prisoners of war, both male and female, represented a necessary resource. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1945, groups of German women prisoners were transported daily from their camps to work on British farms, picking fruit, harvesting vegetables, tending livestock, doing the essential but unglamorous work that kept the nation fed. The farmers who employed them had every reason to be hostile. Many had lost sons, brothers, husbands to German bombs or bullets. Their communities had endured years of rationing, blackouts, and anxiety. Some farmers made their feelings clear, maintaining cold efficiency in their interactions, treating the German women as labor units, rather than people. But others found their anticipated hatred complicated by proximity. These were not the fearsome Nazis of propaganda posters. They were tired young women who struggled with the weight of milk pails, who learned the English names for farming tools with halting pronunciation, who sometimes sang quietly in German as they worked in the fields, melancholy songs that needed no translation. One farmer in Kent, a man who had lost his eldest son at Dunkirk in 1940, found himself watching a young German woman trying to calm a frightened calf. She spoke to the animal in gentle German, the same soothing tones any farmer might use. He realized he was seeing a person, not an enemy. The recognition unsettled him. It would have been easier to maintain his anger against a faceless evil. Instead, he found himself teaching her the proper way to lead a stubborn cow, demonstrating with patient gestures, and she learned with the earnest concentration of someone grateful for small kindnesses. These moments accumulated across the British countryside, small cracks in the edifice of wartime hatred, uncomfortable recognitions of shared humanity. The work programs expanded as autumn arrived. German women prisoners were assigned to hospitals as orderlies, to textile mills and food processing plants, to municipal services in towns still recovering from years of bombing. Each assignment brought new interactions with British civilians. At a hospital in Manchester, German prisoners worked alongside British nurses who had treated casualties from the Blitz. The potential for conflict was obvious, yet something unexpected happened. The German women worked with quiet diligence, changing bedpans, mopping floors, distributing meals to patients. They were deferential, almost excessively so, as if trying to make themselves invisible. Some British staff maintained a cold distance, but others, particularly older nurses who had worked through the previous war as well, began to see patterns they recognized. These women carried themselves with the particular exhaustion of those who had survived sustained trauma. They startled at loud noises. They ate their rations with the mechanical efficiency of people who had known real hunger. A British nurse named Margaret Thornton later recorded her experience in a letter to her sister. She described a German prisoner named Helga, perhaps 23 years old, who had worked at a radar station on the North Sea coast before the war's end. Helga never spoke unless spoken to, never met anyone's eyes directly, never complained about the hardest tasks. One evening, Margaret found her crying quietly in a storage room, trying to muffle the sound. Margaret's first instinct was to walk away. This woman's countrymen had killed Margaret's fiancé over Hamburg in 1943. But something stopped her. She asked what was wrong. Helga struggled to explain in broken English. She had received a letter from the Red Cross. Her entire family had died in the bombing of Dresden in February 1945. Mother, father, 2 younger sisters, all gone. Margaret stood in that storage room, facing a woman she had been taught to hate, and felt the war's terrible arithmetic. Everyone had lost someone. Everyone was grieving, and grief recognized no national boundaries. These small human moments began to multiply across Britain throughout late 1945 and into 1946. They were not universal. Many British citizens maintained their hostility toward German prisoners. Letters to newspapers demanded harsher treatment, argued that feeding and housing the enemy, while British families still struggled with rationing, was an outrage. The government faced pressure to repatriate the prisoners quickly, to be rid of the moral complication they represented. But the practical realities of post-war Europe made immediate repatriation impossible. Germany was devastated, divided, barely functional. The logistics of transporting hundreds of thousands of prisoners back to a shattered nation while still processing displaced persons and refugees overwhelmed available resources. The German women would remain in Britain longer than anyone had initially anticipated. That extended contact would create opportunities for understanding that brief captivity would have prevented. Winter arrived and brought new challenges. Fuel shortages meant inadequate heating in the camps. Food rations remained tight for everyone in Britain, prisoners and civilians alike. The German women endured the cold and hunger with stoic resignation, expecting no sympathy. What they received instead began to transform their understanding of captivity. At a camp in Yorkshire, a group of local women organized a donation drive, collecting blankets and warm clothing for the prisoners. They did not do this out of political conviction, but from simple practicality and a certain northern pragmatism. The German women were cold. There were extra blankets in some households. Waste was unacceptable. When the donations arrived at the camp, the German prisoners were bewildered. Why would their former enemies give them anything? Was this some elaborate test or trick? The British camp administrators were equally uncertain about how to handle this unsolicited civilian charity. But the blankets were distributed, and that night German women slept warmer than they had in weeks, each wrapped in wool that came from a British household, gifted by people who had endured years of German bombing raids. Christmas 1945 approached with particular poignancy. For many German prisoners, this would be their first Christmas in captivity, spent far from home in an enemy country. The British government provided no special provisions for the holiday. Rations remained the same. Work schedules continued. The camps maintained their austere routines. But something shifted in the civilian population, particularly among British families who had traditionally observed Christmas as a time of charity and goodwill. Church. Groups began organizing Christmas parcels for prisoners of war, both German men and women. The parcels were modest, perhaps some sweets, a pair of socks, a small bar of soap, items that were themselves luxuries in rationing Britain. Some donors included simple Christmas cards with generic messages of peace. Others left the parcels anonymous, unable or unwilling to attach their personal goodwill to gifts for the enemy. At the camp near Stratford-upon-Avon, the arrival of these Christmas parcels created a crisis of emotion among the German women. They had prepared themselves for a harsh Christmas, for homesickness and hunger and cold. They had not prepared for kindness. When the parcels were distributed on Christmas Eve, many women broke down completely. Guards reported that the crying lasted for hours, wave after wave of uncontrollable weeping that spread through the barracks. This was not the grateful crying of recipients touched by generosity. This was something rawer, more devastating. These women had been taught that British people were cruel, ruthless, implacable enemies. They had been told that surrender meant torture and death. Instead, they had been fed, clothed, treated with fundamental decency, and now given gifts on Christmas by people who had every reason to hate them. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Everything they had believed about the enemy was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else had been lies? The psychological impact of this kindness proved more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Punishment they could have understood and processed. It would have confirmed their expectations, validated their training, allowed them to maintain their existing worldview. But mercy demanded a complete recalibration of their understanding. If the British were not monsters, if they were capable of humanity even toward former enemies, then perhaps the propaganda they had been fed for years was false. And if British propaganda about Germans was false, what about the propaganda they had absorbed about Jews, about Slavs, about everyone the Reich had designated as inferior or enemy? The questions had no comfortable answers. Many women chose not to pursue them, retreating into emotional numbness as a defense against implications too large and terrible to face. Others began the painful process of reassessment, examining their past beliefs with new and unwelcome clarity. The new year brought an expansion of the work release program. More German women prisoners were allowed to work outside the camps with minimal supervision, particularly in agricultural areas where the risk of escape was low and the need for labor was high. This increased freedom of movement created more opportunities for interaction with British civilians. A woman named Anna, who had served in the Wehrmacht Signals Corps, was assigned to work on a dairy farm in Devon. The farmer's wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson, had lost her husband at Tobruk in 1942 and was managing the farm alone with help from her two teenage daughters. She needed the labor and accepted the German prisoner worker with resignation rather than enthusiasm. Anna arrived expecting coldness, perhaps hostility. What she found was a tired widow trying to keep a farm running and willing to work alongside anyone who pulled their weight. Over the weeks and months that followed, something resembling a working relationship developed. Mrs. Patterson was not warm, but she was fair. She demonstrated tasks clearly, corrected mistakes without anger, shared the same simple lunch she ate herself. Her daughters were initially shy around Anna, uncertain how to behave around a real German, but gradually their natural curiosity overcame their reserve. They asked Anna to teach them German words. They showed her photographs of their father in uniform. They were too young to maintain the pure hatred that war demanded, and too honest to pretend feelings they did not have. For Anna, the experience was profoundly disorienting. She was milking cows on an English farm, eating bread in a kitchen where a photograph of a dead British soldier hung on the wall, teaching English girls to count in German. The absurdity and unexpected normalcy of it existed in such tension that she sometimes felt she might split apart from the contradiction. In February 1946, a severe winter storm struck southern England, bringing heavy snow and freezing temperatures that disrupted transportation and isolated rural communities. Several German women prisoners who had been working at outlying farms found themselves stranded, unable to return to their camps. The British families who employed them faced a decision. They could force these women to attempt the dangerous journey back through the storm, potentially risking their lives, or they could offer temporary shelter until conditions improved. The fact that many British families chose shelter over strict adherence to regulations revealed how much the dynamic had shifted over the months of proximity. German prisoners slept in British homes that night, shared British hearths, ate at British tables. It was temporary, pragmatic, but it was also unprecedented. The enemy was now a guest, however reluctant and awkward that hospitality might be. One woman, a former anti-aircraft auxiliary named Greta, spent 3 days stranded at a farm in Sussex with a family whose son had been killed in the bombing of Coventry in 1940. The family never mentioned their loss to her, but she saw the photographs, noticed the black armband the mother still wore, understood the weight of absence in the house. On the second evening, the family's young daughter, perhaps 7 years old, asked Greta if she had any children. Greta explained in halting English that she was not married, had no children. The girl, with the blunt honesty of childhood, asked if the war had killed Greta's family too. The question hung in the cold air of that farmhouse kitchen. Greta's mother and younger brother had died in a British bombing raid on Berlin in 1944. She nodded. The girl's mother quickly tried to change the subject, to smooth over the uncomfortable moment. But the girl persisted with child logic. If the war had hurt both of them, then they were the same, weren't they? The adults had no answer that satisfied the simple mathematics of suffering. By spring 1946, public opinion in Britain regarding German prisoners had become increasingly complex and divided. Some citizens remained firmly opposed to any fraternization or kindness, arguing that Germans deserved no sympathy after what they had done to Europe. Others, particularly those who had direct contact with German prisoners through employment or community interactions, found their attitudes shifting despite themselves. Letters to newspapers reflected this division. One correspondent wrote that treating Germans with decency dishonored the memory of British dead. Another argued that showing humanity to former enemies was precisely what distinguished Britain from Nazi Germany, that mercy was not weakness but strength. The government maintained its official policy of correct but not warm treatment, aware that public sentiment remained volatile and potentially politically dangerous. The German women themselves navigated this uncertain terrain with extreme caution. They had learned that some British people would treat them decently while others would not, but predicting who would respond how remained difficult. They developed strategies for minimizing conflict, making themselves useful, staying quiet, avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as arrogant or unrepentant. Many adopted an almost exaggerated deference, a performance of humility designed to diffuse potential hostility. This was partly genuine remorse for the war's devastation, partly pragmatic self-protection, partly the learned behavior of the defeated. They understood they were living on the complicated mercy of a nation they had helped bomb, and that mercy could be withdrawn at any moment if they overstepped invisible boundaries they were still learning to perceive. As the months passed, some German women prisoners began to receive letters from home, forwarded through the Red Cross from occupied Germany. The letters brought devastating news: cities destroyed, families dead or scattered, widespread starvation, the Soviet occupation zone's brutal conditions, the slow realization of the Holocaust's full scope. Many prisoners had believed the stories of concentration camps and mass murder were Allied propaganda, exaggerations designed to demonize Germany. Now letters from home confirmed the unthinkable. Some women refused to believe it, convinced their relatives were lying under Allied pressure. Others felt the foundations of their worldview crack completely. They had served a regime that committed industrial genocide. They had believed in a cause that was not merely defeated, but evil. The psychological reckoning this demanded was beyond what many could process. Some withdrew into depression, others clung to denial. A few began the painful work of accepting their complicity, however unwitting, in atrocities beyond comprehension. A young woman named Margaret, who had worked as a decoder for military communications, received a letter from her father in Hamburg. He wrote cautiously, aware that Allied censors would read his words, but his meaning was clear. He had not known, he insisted, but now he knew, and he would carry that knowledge like a stone for the rest of his life. He asked her forgiveness for raising her in a system of lies. The letter destroyed something in Margaret. She had idolized her father, believed in his integrity, trusted his judgment. If he had been deceived, if he acknowledged his own culpability, then she could not exempt herself. She began to question every memory, every lesson, every value she had absorbed during her youth. It was like discovering that the ground beneath her feet had always been rotten, that everything she had built her identity upon was false. The British camp administrators noticed her deterioration, but had no resources to address it. There were no psychiatrists available for German prisoners dealing with existential crisis. She would have to navigate her collapse alone, surrounded by other women fighting similar battles with their shattered beliefs. The arrival of spring in 1946 brought increased agricultural work and more opportunities for German prisoners to work outside the camps. The rhythm of planting season, the optimism of new growth, the warming weather created an atmosphere of renewal that contrasted sharply with the moral darkness many of these women were confronting. They worked in British fields, planting crops they would not harvest, preparing a future in a country that was not their home and would never be their home. The work was physically exhausting, but mentally merciful, requiring enough concentration to quiet the endless loops of guilt and confusion. Some British farmers who employed them noticed that the German women worked with an almost desperate intensity, as if trying to exhaust themselves into numbness. In May 1946, the first substantial repatriation efforts began. The British government announced plans to return German prisoners to the Western occupation zones of Germany throughout the coming months. The news created unexpected reactions among the women prisoners. Some were desperate to return home despite knowing what awaited them. Others felt a complicated reluctance. Britain had become a strange refuge, a place where they were prisoners, but also paradoxically safe, fed, and treated with a fundamental decency that letters from home suggested might not exist in occupied Germany. Some women feared return to a devastated country, to hunger and chaos and the shame of defeat. Others feared they had become too comfortable in captivity, too separated from their suffering countrymen, and that return would reveal them as traitors who had lived relatively well while their nation starved. A group of German women at the Yorkshire camp petitioned to remain in Britain as voluntary workers rather than be repatriated. The request baffled British authorities. Why would anyone choose to remain in the country that had defeated them, among people who had every reason to hate them? The women struggled to articulate their reasoning. Some mentioned the relative stability and safety of Britain compared to the chaos described in letters from home. Others spoke vaguely of wanting to make amends through labor, to somehow balance the scales by contributing to British recovery. A few admitted more honestly that they no longer felt German in the way they once had, that their national identity had been so compromised by guilt and disillusionment that they were unmoored, belonging nowhere. The government denied the petitions. All German prisoners would be repatriated according to schedule. There would be no exceptions, no matter how sincerely requested. The summer of 1946 marked a subtle shift in British civilian attitudes toward German prisoners as repatriation accelerated. There was a sense of ending, of a chapter closing. Some British families who had employed German workers through small farewell gatherings, modest affairs with tea and simple food, awkward but genuine expressions of something that was not quite friendship but was more than mere employer-employee relations. At the Devon dairy farm, Mrs. Patterson gave Anna a small parcel as she prepared to leave. A warm scarf, a bar of soap, and a loaf of fresh bread for her journey. She said nothing, just pressed the parcel into Anna's hands and turned away quickly, unwilling to show emotion. Anna understood that this was as close to forgiveness as she would ever receive, and it was more than she deserved. She left without looking back, afraid that if she did, she would break down completely. The journey back to Germany proved difficult for many women. They traveled in military trucks and trains through a landscape still bearing visible scars of war. When they crossed into Germany and saw the devastation firsthand, the reality exceeded even the grim descriptions in letters. Cities were lunar landscapes of rubble. Refugees crowded the roads. Hunger was visible in every face. The women were processed through repatriation centers where Allied officials verified their identities, screened them for potential war crimes connections, and issued papers allowing them to travel to their homes if those homes still existed. Many women discovered that home was now a pile of bricks, that relatives were dead or missing, that the life they had left no longer existed in any recognizable form. Greta returned to her family's apartment block in Berlin to find it destroyed, a crater where the building had stood. Neighbors she barely recognized told her that her mother and brother had died in the 1944 raid, information she already knew from official notification, but which became real only when standing in the physical absence of her home. She had nowhere to go, no family left, no resources beyond the clothes she wore, and the few items she had been allowed to keep from her prisoner belongings. She found temporary shelter in a church basement that housed displaced persons, sleeping among strangers, many of whom were themselves former prisoners or refugees from the Eastern Territories. In that crowded basement, listening to the coughs and murmurs of traumatized people trying to sleep, she found herself thinking about the farm in Sussex where she had spent those 3 days during the winter storm. She remembered the warmth of the kitchen, the simple but adequate food, the tentative kindness that family had shown despite their grief. She had been better treated as a prisoner in England than she was now as a free person in her own devastated country. The irony was so sharp it nearly drew blood. Other women faced different challenges upon return. Margaret, the decoder, traveled to Hamburg to reunite with her father. Their reunion was strained, heavy with unspoken guilt and confusion. Her father had aged dramatically in the years since she had last seen him. They spoke carefully around the topics that mattered most, unable to address directly the questions that consumed them both. How had they been so deceived? How much had they suspected but refused to acknowledge? What was their responsibility for what had been done in Germany's name? These questions hung between them like smoke, choking but insubstantial, impossible to grasp or dispel. They established a fragile routine of daily survival, focusing on practical matters, obtaining ration cards, finding fuel for heating, repairing their damaged apartment. The larger moral questions remained unresolved because neither had the strength or clarity to resolve them. They would carry those questions for the rest of their lives, wounds that could not heal because acknowledging them fully would be unbearable. The repatriation process continued through late 1946 and into 1947. By the spring of 1947, most German women prisoners had been returned to Germany. A few remained in British custody due to ongoing investigations into their wartime activities, particularly those who had served in roles with potential connections to war crimes. The camps emptied. The barracks that had housed thousands of women reverted to other uses or were dismantled entirely. The British families who had employed German workers returned to managing their farms and businesses with British labor, or learned to cope with continued shortages. Life moved forward, as it always does, toward new concerns and crises. The brief period of intimate contact between former enemies receded into memory, extraordinary but temporary, a strange interlude in the long arc of history. But the impact of that contact endured in unexpected ways. British families who had employed German prisoners who had shared meals and work and small kindnesses with women they had been taught to hate found their views on war and enmity complicated in ways they struggled to articulate. They had seen the human face of the enemy and could not unsee it. When politicians spoke of Germans in abstract terms, these British families remembered specific women: Anna's gentle handling of frightened livestock, Helga's quiet grief, Greta's dignity in defeat. The experience did not make them pacifists or naive about the realities of conflict, but it made simple hatred more difficult. They had learned that recognizing the humanity of enemies did not mean excusing their actions or forgetting the harm they had done. It meant something more complex and uncomfortable. Understanding that evil was not confined to monsters, but could be perpetrated by ordinary people who loved their families, mourned their losses, and were capable of both cruelty and compassion. For the German women who had been prisoners in Britain, the impact was even more profound and lasting. They carried memories of British kindness as complicated treasures, evidence that contradicted the propaganda they had been fed, but also made their own complicity harder to bear. If British people could show mercy to their enemies, what did it say about Germans who had shown none? The comparison was devastating. Some women spoke about their experiences in Britain to family and friends, describing the unexpected decency they had received. Others kept silent, uncertain whether their stories would be believed or would be interpreted as weakness or collaboration. In a Germany struggling with collective guilt and desperate to rebuild both physically and psychologically, tales of enemy kindness fit awkwardly into the prevailing narratives of victimhood and suffering. It was easier to remember German suffering than to acknowledge that the enemy had sometimes behaved more humanely than Germans themselves. Anna, working in a textile factory in the Ruhr Valley in 1948, found herself thinking often about Mrs. Patterson and her daughters in Devon. She wondered if they were managing the farm successfully, if the daughters had grown, if Mrs. Patterson still wore her black armband for her dead husband. Anna had no way to contact them, no ability to express the gratitude and confusion and regret that consumed her. She had been shown kindness by a woman whose husband her country had killed, and she did not know what to do with that knowledge except carry it like a weight. When coworkers complained about Allied occupation policies or rationing or the hardships of post-war life, Anna remained silent. She could not join in the collective resentment because she remembered that her British captors had fed her, clothed her, given her Christmas presents, and treated her with more dignity than she deserved. That memory isolated her, made her an uncomfortable presence among people who preferred simpler narratives of good and evil, victim and oppressor. By 1950, Germany was beginning to recover, at least in the Western zones. The Marshall Plan brought aid and investment. Cities slowly rebuilt from rubble. A new generation was growing up in the shadow of war, but also in the hope of reconstruction. The women who had been prisoners in Britain were now in their late 20s and early 30s, settling into jobs, some marrying, some remaining single, all carrying private histories they shared rarely and incompletely. They were part of a larger cohort of Germans grappling with how to live after collective catastrophe, how to build normal lives on the foundation of extraordinary guilt and loss. Most chose to focus on the future, on practical matters, on the daily work of survival and reconstruction. The past was too painful, too complicated, too morally fraught to examine closely. It was easier to lock those memories away, to speak of them only in the most general terms, to let time create distance and perhaps eventually absolution. But some memories resisted burial. The Christmas parcels, the donated blankets, the British families who had treated them with inexplicable decency. These memories surfaced unexpectedly. When reading about British-German reconciliation efforts, when hearing children play in languages that mixed English and German in the cosmopolitan cities of the 1950s, when encountering British tourists beginning to visit Germany again as normal tourism resumed. Each encounter was a small reminder that their former enemies had chosen mercy over revenge, humanity over hatred, and that choice had been more devastating than any punishment could have been. It had forced these women to confront their own humanity, their own complicity, their own capacity for self-deception. That confrontation was a lifelong process, never complete, never resolved, a continuous reckoning with questions that had no comfortable answers. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO, becoming an official ally of Britain and other Western powers in the Cold War's new configurations. Former enemies were now partners against the Soviet threat. The transformation was dizzying in its speed and thoroughness. German rearmament, which would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, was now actively encouraged by the same nations that had defeated Hitler. The women who had been prisoners in Britain watched this diplomatic transformation with complicated feelings. On one level, it validated their wartime service, suggested that Germany had not been entirely wrong to fear Soviet communism, reframed the war's meaning in ways that were less morally clear-cut. On another level, it felt like a betrayal of the difficult moral truths they had learned. The world was moving on, rewriting history for political convenience, and the harder lessons about human nature, about the capacity for both evil and mercy, about the complexity of enemies and allies, were being simplified or forgotten entirely. Greta, now working as a secretary in Munich, attended a lecture in 1957 about British-German friendship societies, organizations dedicated to building cultural bridges between the former enemy nations. The speaker, a British academic, discussed the importance of moving beyond the war, of recognizing shared values and common interests, of building a peaceful future. Greta listened and felt simultaneously inspired and frustrated. This narrative of reconciliation was easier, cleaner than the messy reality she remembered. It skipped over the hard parts, the grinding work of recognizing one's own evil, the unbearable weight of undeserved mercy, the way kindness from those you have harmed is more painful than their hatred. The lecture presented reconciliation as a rational choice, a diplomatic achievement. But Greta knew it was also something more personal and more difficult. The moment when a British farmer's daughter had asked if the war had hurt them both, and Greta had been forced to acknowledge a shared humanity she had been trained to deny. As the decades passed, the women who had been prisoners in Britain aged into middle-aged and then elderly women. The post-war era gave way to the 1960s, then the 1970s, transforming Germany into an economic powerhouse, a stable democracy, a nation that seemed to have successfully confronted its past through processes of denazification and historical education. The women's grandchildren learned about the Holocaust in school, visited concentration camp memorials, participated in international exchange programs with Britain and other nations. This new generation asked questions their grandmothers struggled to answer. What had they known? When had they known it? How could they have served such a regime? The grandmothers explained as best they could about propaganda, about conformity, about the gradual normalization of evil, about the difficulty of seeing clearly from inside a totalitarian system. They spoke about their time as prisoners in Britain, about the unexpected kindness they received, and their grandchildren listened with the mild incomprehension of those who had grown up in peace and prosperity. Anna, in her 60s in the mid-1970s, finally attempted to contact Mrs. Patterson in Devon. She had carried the memory of that family for 3 decades, and she wanted somehow to express what their decency had meant to her, even if that meaning was complicated and impossible to fully articulate. She wrote a careful letter in her best English, explaining who she was, thanking Mrs. Patterson for her fairness and kindness during those difficult years. She sent the letter to the farm's address, uncertain whether the family still lived there, uncertain whether Mrs. Patterson was even still alive, uncertain what response, if any, she could expect. Weeks passed, then months. No reply came. Anna tried to convince herself that the letter had simply not reached its destination, that the family had moved, that Mrs. Patterson had not recognized the name of a German prisoner who had worked on her farm briefly 3 decades ago. But she also acknowledged the possibility that Mrs. Patterson had received the letter and chosen not to respond, that some wounds or memories should not be reopened, that the past was better left undisturbed. The question of forgiveness haunted many of these women as they aged. They had been forgiven in a sense, granted mercy and basic decency by British captors when punishment would have been understandable, but forgiveness and mercy are not the same thing. Mercy can be given without emotional reconciliation, offered as policy or principle rather than personal absolution. The British families who had shown them kindness had done so for complex reasons. Christian charity, practical need for labor, innate human decency, perhaps simply the exhaustion that comes from sustaining hatred for years. But had they truly forgiven? Could anyone truly forgive the perpetrators and enablers of such catastrophic evil? The women did not know. They suspected that forgiveness, if it existed at all, was something more provisional and fragile than religious teaching suggested. Granted moment by moment rather than permanently, and always shadowed by the magnitude of harm that could never be fully repaired or forgotten. In the 1980s and 1990s, as the women entered their final decades, some participated in oral history projects documenting the experiences of German women during and after World War II. They spoke carefully, aware that their stories fit awkwardly into prevailing narratives. They were neither pure victims nor actively criminal perpetrators, but something in between. Complicit participants in a genocidal regime who had also themselves suffered, who had received unexpected mercy from those they had harmed, who carried guilt and gratitude in such complicated mixture that simple moral categories failed. The historians who interviewed them sometimes struggled to know how to interpret their accounts. Were these stories of reconciliation, examples of how former enemies could recognize shared humanity? Or were they stories of moral evasion, attempts to focus on British kindness rather than confront German evil? The truth was probably both, and neither, and something more complex than either interpretation could capture. Margaret, now in her 70s, participated in a British-German reconciliation event in Hamburg in 1992. Former prisoners of war and British veterans gathered to speak about their experiences and to formally acknowledge the path from enmity to alliance. Margaret shared the stage with a British woman who had served as a nurse during the war and who had worked alongside German prisoners in a Manchester hospital. The British woman spoke about her initial hostility toward the German prisoners, her gradual recognition of their humanity, her continuing struggle to reconcile that recognition with the deaths of her friends and colleagues in the Blitz. Margaret listened and felt the familiar weight of complicated truth. This woman's honesty was harder to hear than simple forgiveness would have been. It acknowledged the reality that some harms are too great for complete healing, that living with moral complexity is the best that humans can sometimes achieve. After the formal presentations, the two women spoke briefly, politely. They did not become friends. They did not exchange addresses or promise to stay in contact, but they had stood together in public acknowledgement of a shared difficult history, and that acknowledgement was itself a kind of truth-telling, incomplete but real. The women began to die in the late 1990s and early 2000s, reaching the end of natural lifespans shaped by the terrible history they had lived through. They took with them memories that could never be fully communicated, experiences that resisted easy interpretation or moral simplification. Some spoke to their families about their time as prisoners in Britain, trying to pass on lessons about human nature, about the capacity for mercy even in the darkest circumstances, about the importance of seeing the humanity in enemies. Others remained largely silent, feeling that their experiences were too personal, too complicated, or simply irrelevant to a modern world that had moved far beyond the concerns of 1945. They died in the comfortable prosperity of modern Germany, in a country that bore almost no physical resemblance to the devastated landscape they had returned to in 1946, in a nation that had confronted its past more thoroughly than most, but still struggled with the full weight of that history. The last of these women died sometime in the 2010s, taking with them the living memory of those extraordinary years. What remains are fragmentary records, archived letters, official documentation of prisoner programs, occasional memoirs, oral histories captured by researchers, and the transmitted memories held by children and grandchildren who heard these stories secondhand. These fragments paint a picture of a unique historical moment when former enemies lived in unexpected proximity, when British mercy confronted German guilt, when small acts of kindness complicated the simple narratives that war demands. The encounter transformed both groups in ways that were subtle but lasting, teaching lessons about human nature that remain relevant precisely because they resist comfortable conclusions. The British families who showed kindness to German prisoners did not do so to teach a moral lesson or to demonstrate superiority. They did so for practical reasons, out of religious conviction, from simple human decency, or because maintaining hatred across months of daily contact proved exhausting and ultimately impossible. Their mercy was not a grand gesture, but an accumulation of small choices: sharing a meal, offering a blanket, treating another person with basic respect, despite every reason to do otherwise. These choices were unremarkable in themselves, barely worth recording, yet they had profound effects on women who had expected only punishment and found instead a more complicated and devastating gift: the recognition of their own humanity at the moment when they least deserved it. The German women who received this mercy were forced into a psychological reckoning more painful than physical punishment would have been. Cruelty would have confirmed their training, validated their victimhood, allowed them to maintain their existing beliefs. Kindness destroyed those comforting fictions. It forced them to recognize that they had served an evil regime, that they had been deceived by their leaders and by themselves, that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of more humanity than they had shown. This recognition was unbearable for many. It required acknowledging complicity, confronting guilt, rebuilding identity from foundations that had proven rotten. Some women could not or would not complete this process, choosing instead various forms of denial or selective memory. Others spent the rest of their lives struggling with these questions, never reaching resolution but refusing the comfort of simple answers. The historical lesson, if there is one, is not that mercy always transforms enemies into friends, or that kindness can overcome any evil. The story is more complicated and less comforting. It suggests that humans are capable of both terrible evil and surprising compassion, sometimes simultaneously. It demonstrates that recognizing the humanity of enemies does not require approving their actions or minimizing their harm, but it does demand acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that those who commit atrocities are human too. Not monsters, but people who made terrible choices from within systems that normalize those choices. It shows that mercy can be a weapon more devastating than revenge, not because it changes enemies immediately, but because it forces them to confront their own moral failures without the comfort of victimhood to soften that confrontation. The war ended on May 8, 1945, but for these women the real battle began afterward. The struggle to understand what they had been part of, to process the unexpected mercy they received, to build lives in the shadow of individual and collective guilt. They arrived in Britain as captives, prepared for punishment. They left as something more complex, witnesses to an alternative possibility, people who had experienced enemy humanity and been devastated by it, women who would spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of undeserved kindness from those they had helped harm. The tears they cried when British families did this one unexpected thing, when they were treated with simple human decency despite everything, were not tears of gratitude but of something harder and more painful. The tears of people forced to recognize their own capacity for self-deception, their own complicity in evil, their own need for the mercy they did not deserve. Those tears marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a lifelong reckoning that would never fully resolve, but could not be avoided by those who had experienced the terrible gift of enemy compassion.